They should have frozen to death before sunrise. That was what every forecast, every mile of wilderness, and every howl of the storm seemed to promise. Yet somewhere beyond the curtain of snow, something was already searching for them. The wind swept across the Wyoming backcountry like a living thing, carrying needles of ice that stung exposed skin and erased every track within minutes. Michael Carter pulled his daughter closer as they struggled through drifts nearly waist-deep. Each step felt heavier than the last. His legs burned. His lungs ached. The cold had found its way through every layer of clothing hours ago. Beside him, Emily Carter wrapped one arm around 12-year-old Lily, trying to shield her from the relentless gusts. Lily's small boots dragged through the snow. Her cheeks were pale. Her eyelids drooped. Every few moments she stumbled, and each stumble terrified her parents more than the last. The forest around them had disappeared into a blur of white shadows and black pine trunks. There was no road. No cabin. No sign of another human being for miles. Only snow, darkness, and the growing fear that they were walking in circles. Michael checked the compass clipped to his jacket for the 10th time in an hour. The needle trembled beneath a layer of frost. It hardly mattered anymore. Visibility had dropped to less than 20 feet. The storm swallowed everything. Even sound seemed trapped beneath the endless roar of wind. Then Lily stopped walking. "Dad!" Her voice came out weak and distant. Michael turned instantly. His heart tightened. "Come on, sweetheart. Just a little farther." She nodded but nearly lost her balance. Emily caught her before she fell. Snowflakes clung to Lily's eyelashes. Her breathing had become shallow. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence between them carried a fear no parent ever wanted to name. Then something moved ahead. Michael froze. A shape emerged briefly through the blowing snow. 4 legs. Pointed ears. A dog. The animal stood motionless about 30 feet away. Large. Alert. Watching them. Its thick sable coat rippled beneath layers of snow. Amber eyes reflected faintly against the gray sky. A German shepherd. For several seconds nobody moved. The dog simply stood there. Calm. Silent. Almost unreal. Emily blinked, wondering if exhaustion had created an illusion. But the shepherd remained. It tilted its head slightly, studying them. Then it turned and walked away into the storm. "Wait," Michael called instinctively. The dog stopped. It glanced back over its shoulder. Then continued forward. A few yards later it stopped again. Looking back once more. As if expecting them to follow. Michael exchanged a look with Emily. Neither needed to say it aloud. They had no better option. Gathering the last of their strength, they followed the shepherd into the white wilderness. The dog moved with quiet confidence, weaving between snow-covered pines and hidden ridges as though it knew every inch of the mountain. Again and again it disappeared behind swirling curtains of snow, only to reappear moments later farther ahead. Always waiting. Always watching. And for the first time all night, something unfamiliar stirred beneath the fear gripping Michael Carter's chest. Hope. The German shepherd never hurried. That was what Michael noticed first. The dog moved through the storm with the calm certainty of something that already knew the destination. Every few yards it paused and looked back, waiting until the Carter family caught up before continuing forward. Snow collected along its back and ears, yet it seemed completely unaffected by the cold that was draining the strength from every member of the family. The forest grew denser as they followed. Tall pines stood like silent sentries beneath the weight of fresh snow. Branches creaked overhead. The air smelled of ice, evergreen sap, and distant wood smoke. Michael stopped suddenly. "Do you smell that?" Emily lifted her head. For the first time in hours, she noticed it too. Smoke. Faint. but unmistakable. The scent drifted through the storm like a promise. The dog continued forward. Hope quickened their pace. Even Lily seemed to find enough strength for a few more steps. Her small hand remained locked inside her mother's glove. 10 minutes later, a warm glow appeared through the swirling white darkness. At first Michael thought it was another trick of exhaustion. Then the light grew brighter. A cabin. Hidden among the trees. Soft golden light spilled from 2 frost-covered windows. Smoke rose steadily from a stone chimney into the stormy night sky. The sight felt almost impossible. Like stumbling upon an island after days at sea. The German shepherd trotted directly toward the porch. As the family approached, the cabin door opened. A tall man stepped outside carrying a lantern. He stood motionless beneath the porch light. His broad shoulders filled the doorway. Snowflakes drifted around him. His face remained calm, alert, unreadable. The man looked to be in his late 30s. His dark winter jacket was worn but well maintained. His eyes moved carefully from Michael to Emily and finally to Lily. Then his gaze settled on the German shepherd. For a brief moment, genuine surprise crossed his face. "Ghost," he said quietly. The dog climbed the porch steps and sat beside him. The man looked back toward the family. "You have been out there too long." His voice carried the steady confidence of someone accustomed to difficult situations. "Come inside before the cold gets any worse." None of them hesitated. Warm air rushed over them the moment they crossed the threshold. Lily nearly cried from relief. The cabin smelled of pine wood, coffee, and burning cedar logs. A fire crackled inside a large stone fireplace. Lantern light cast soft golden shadows across rough wooden walls decorated with maps, fishing gear, and old framed photographs. Emily wrapped both hands around a steaming mug the man offered her. Michael sat heavily near the fire while Lily stretched her frozen fingers toward the warmth. Color slowly returned to her cheeks. The man introduced himself simply. "Ethan Walker." Michael thanked him repeatedly, but Ethan only nodded. His attention seemed divided. Several times his eyes drifted toward Ghost. The shepherd had not settled down beside the fire. Instead, the dog stood near one of the windows. Watching the storm. Listening. Waiting. Ethan noticed Michael looking. "That is unusual." "What is?" Michael asked. Ethan studied the dog for a moment. "Ghost led you here." Michael nodded. "He found us out there." Ethan remained silent. The fire crackled between them. Finally he spoke. "I have lived with that dog for 6 years. His eyes never left Ghost. And he has never once brought strangers home." The words lingered in the warm cabin long after Ethan spoke them. Michael glanced toward the German shepherd again. Ghost remained near the window, his silhouette outlined by the pale glow of snow reflecting through the glass. Outside, the storm continued to sweep across the mountains, rattling branches and sending waves of powder against the cabin walls. Inside, however, the fire offered a fragile sense of safety. Lily sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket Ethan had pulled from a cedar chest. Color had returned to her face, but exhaustion still weighed heavily on her eyes. She watched Ghost quietly. There was something about him that felt different from any dog she had ever met. Not friendlier. Not more obedient. Just older somehow. As if he carried memories no one else could see. Ethan added another log to the fire. Sparks floated upward and disappeared into the chimney. The cabin filled with the scent of cedar and smoke. For the first time all day, Michael felt warmth reach his hands. Yet beneath that comfort, a strange uneasiness remained. It began when Ghost suddenly turned away from the window and walked directly toward Lily. The shepherd lowered his head and carefully sniffed the sleeve of her coat. Then her gloves. Then the small silver necklace resting against her sweater. His ears lifted. His posture stiffened. Ethan noticed immediately. That is odd. Lily looked down nervously. What is he doing? Ethan knelt beside the dog. Ghost continued staring at the necklace. It was nothing expensive. Just a small silver pendant hanging from a worn chain. Lily touched it instinctively. It belonged to my Uncle Ryan, she said softly. The moment the name left her lips, Ghost froze. The room seemed to grow quieter. Even the crackling fire faded into the background. Ethan slowly looked up. Something in his expression changed. Michael noticed it immediately. You knew him? Ethan did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the pendant. Finally he spoke. Ryan Carter. Michael nodded. My older brother. Ghost released a low whine. Not fear. Not discomfort. Recognition. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. Ethan sat back slowly. For several seconds he simply stared at the dog. Then he exhaled. That cannot be possible. Emily exchanged a confused glance with Michael. What are you talking about? Ethan looked toward the snow-covered darkness outside the window. His voice grew quieter. Years ago, before I left active service, there was a handler named Ryan Carter. Michael's eyes widened. My brother served overseas. Ethan nodded once. So did I. Silence settled over the room. The kind of silence that feels heavy with old memories. Ghost walked away from Lily and moved toward the front door. He sat facing it. Watching. Waiting. Ethan frowned. The dog had become unusually alert. Then another sound reached them. Faint. Almost impossible to hear beneath the storm. A metallic clink from somewhere outside. Michael turned his head. Did you hear that? Nobody answered immediately. Ghost was already on his feet. His ears stood tall. His amber eyes locked on the darkness beyond the cabin walls. Ethan rose calmly and stepped toward the nearest window. Snow swirled across the porch. Nothing moved. Yet Ghost continued staring into the storm as though he sensed something approaching long before anyone else could. The sound never came again. For nearly a minute, nobody moved. The storm pressed against the cabin walls while Ghost remained fixed beside the door, every muscle tense beneath his thick winter coat. Ethan continued staring through the frosted window. Outside was nothing but swirling white darkness and the faint outline of snow-covered pines. Yet years of training had taught him to trust instincts long before evidence appeared. And Ghost's instincts had saved lives more than once. Finally Ethan stepped away from the window. It is probably nothing, he said calmly, though his eyes suggested otherwise. This mountain plays tricks during storms. Michael nodded, but the uneasiness remained. Emily squeezed Lily's hand. The warmth of the fire should have felt comforting. Instead the room seemed strangely suspended between safety and uncertainty. Ghost eventually relaxed enough to leave the door. He crossed the cabin slowly and settled beside the stone fireplace. Even then, his ears continued twitching toward sounds no one else seemed able to hear. Ethan poured fresh coffee into a mug and sat across from Michael. The lantern light softened the hard lines of his face. Snowflakes drifted lazily beyond the windows. For the first time since their arrival, the cabin felt quiet enough for questions. Michael glanced toward the silver pendant around Lily's neck. You said you knew Ryan. Ethan stared into the fire for several moments before answering. I knew him better than most people did. His voice carried the weight of old memories. We served together for almost 3 years. Emily leaned forward slightly. You never told us that, she said to Michael. Michael shook his head. Ryan rarely talked about his deployments. Ethan nodded. Most of us did not. The fire crackled softly between them. Shadows danced across the wooden walls. Lily listened carefully while Ghost rested his head on his paws nearby. Ryan was the kind of man people followed without realizing they were following him, Ethan continued. Calm. Steady. Always looking out for everyone else. A faint smile appeared. And Ghost adored him. The room fell silent. Lily blinked. Ghost knew my uncle. Ethan slowly nodded. Ghost was his partner. Lily looked toward the German shepherd in disbelief. The dog lifted his head at the sound of his name. For a brief moment, his amber eyes met hers. Something passed through the room then. Not fear. Not surprise. Something gentler. Like two distant pieces of a story quietly finding each other. Ethan stood and walked toward an old wooden shelf near the fireplace. Several framed photographs rested there beneath a layer of dust. He picked one up and returned to the table. Michael stared at the picture. His breath caught instantly. There was Ryan. Younger. Smiling. Standing in front of a mountain sunrise. Beside him sat a younger Ghost, proud and alert. Lily carefully touched the edge of the frame. That is him. Ethan nodded. Taken 7 years ago. The cabin grew quiet once more. Then Ghost suddenly rose to his feet. His head turned sharply toward the back of the cabin. Without a sound, he walked across the room and stopped beside a narrow hallway leading deeper into the house. He stared at the floorboards. His nose twitched. Once. Twice. Then he began scratching gently at a specific spot in the wood as though something beneath it had been waiting a very long time to be found. For several seconds nobody spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant moan of wind moving through the trees outside. Ghost continued scratching at the same section of floorboards with quiet determination. Not frantic. Not playful. Purposeful. Ethan stared at him. He has never done that before. The German shepherd paused only long enough to look back at Ethan, then returned to the spot. His nose pressed against the wood. His tail remained perfectly still. Lily slowly stood and stepped closer. Maybe he smells something. Ethan grabbed a lantern and crossed the room. The warm light illuminated the narrow hallway and the worn pine boards beneath Ghost's paws. Time had darkened the wood. Dust rested along the edges. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Ghost refused to move. Ethan knelt beside him and ran a hand across the floor. His fingers stopped at a thin seam barely visible beneath years of wear. His expression changed immediately. Help me with this. Michael joined him. Together they carefully lifted a loose board that neither of them would have noticed otherwise. A small pocket had been carved beneath the floor. Hidden inside rested a weathered metal box no larger than a shoebox. Dust covered its surface. The corners showed traces of rust. Emily stared in disbelief. How long has that been there? Ethan slowly shook his head. I do not know. Ghost stepped back and sat quietly. His work was finished. Ethan lifted the box carefully and carried it to the table near the fireplace. The lantern glow reflected across the metal lid. Everyone gathered around. Even Lily seemed too nervous to breathe. The box was locked with a simple latch. Ethan opened it gently. Inside lay several items wrapped in an old military cloth. A folded map. A notebook. A silver compass. And resting on top of everything else, a pair of military dog tags. The room fell silent. Michael reached for them with trembling fingers. The metal glinted in the firelight. One tag bore a name he knew instantly. Ryan Carter. His older brother. For a moment Michael simply stared. Years seemed to vanish from his face. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. Lily looked between them, confused and fascinated. Ethan sat motionless. His eyes never left the dog tags. Ghost quietly lowered himself beside the table. His amber eyes reflected the dancing firelight. Almost as though he had been waiting for this moment. Ethan finally unfolded the map. Several locations had been marked in faded ink. Beside them were handwritten notes. Careful. Precise. Ryan's handwriting. Ethan recognized it immediately. Then he opened the notebook. A folded photograph slipped free and landed on the table. Lily picked it up. Her breath caught. The picture showed a younger Ryan standing beside Ghost years earlier. Both looked directly at the camera. Both looked happy. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, were 8 simple words. If Ghost finds this, follow where he leads. Nobody spoke after reading the message. Outside, the storm continued to rage across the mountains. Inside, every eye slowly turned toward the German Shepherd. Ghost met their gaze calmly. Then he stood, walked toward the cabin door, and looked back as though the next part of the journey was waiting somewhere beyond the snow. For a long moment, nobody moved. The message written on the back of the photograph seemed to linger in the warm air of the cabin long after the words had been read. If Ghost finds this, follow where he leads. The handwriting belonged to Ryan. Michael knew it instantly. He had seen birthday cards, letters, and old notes written in that same careful script throughout his childhood. Yet this message felt different. It felt less like a memory and more like a voice reaching across years. Ghost stood quietly by the door. Snow swirled beyond the frosted windows. The storm had not weakened. If anything, the wind sounded stronger now, sweeping across the mountains with a low mournful hum. Ethan folded the photograph carefully and placed it beside the map. His eyes moved between the dog tags and Ghost. Ryan never did anything without a reason, he said softly. If he left that message, he expected Ghost to find this box someday. Emily looked toward the weather outside. Tonight? Ethan glanced at the window. Probably not. But Ghost seems to think otherwise. As if he understood every word, the German Shepherd stepped closer to the door and released a low impatient whine. Not fear. Not anxiety. Determination. Lily stood and walked toward him. The silver pendant rested against her sweater. Ghost lowered his head and gently touched the pendant with his nose. Then he looked directly into her eyes. Lily smiled faintly. I think he wants us to come. Michael should have dismissed the idea. Every sensible part of him knew nobody should be wandering through a blizzard in the middle of the night. Yet nothing about the last several hours had been sensible. A dog had found them in the wilderness. That same dog had led them to a cabin owned by a man who once served beside Ryan. Then Ghost had uncovered a hidden box containing a message that seemed written specifically for this moment. Ethan opened the notebook again. Several pages contained weathered notes and rough sketches of mountain trails. One page caught his attention immediately. A hand-drawn circle marked a location approximately 2 miles northeast of the cabin. Beside it Ryan had written 3 words. The Silent Ridge. Ethan stared at the map. A memory surfaced. I know that place. Michael looked up. What is it? Ethan traced the location with one finger. An old ranger lookout. Abandoned for years. He frowned slightly. Ryan liked it because nobody ever went there. Ghost's ears lifted instantly. The dog walked to Ethan's side and stared at the map. The room fell silent again. Outside, the storm continued its endless song. Then something unexpected happened. The wind briefly shifted. Through the cabin window, moonlight broke through a gap in the clouds for the first time all night. A narrow beam of silver light stretched across the snow-covered landscape. Beyond the trees. Ethan slowly looked toward the glow. Ghost was already watching it. Waiting. As though he had been expecting that exact moment. Ethan folded the map and slipped it into his jacket. "We leave at first light," he said quietly. Ghost finally settled onto the floor beside the door. For the first time all evening, the old shepherd closed his eyes. It was almost as if he knew they had chosen the right path. Morning arrived quietly. The storm that had seemed endless during the night had finally loosened its grip on the mountains. Pale sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows, painting the cabin walls with soft shades of gold and silver. Outside, the world looked untouched. Snow blanketed every ridge and pine branch. The air carried that rare stillness that follows a long storm, when even the forest seems to pause and listen. Ghost was already awake. He stood beside the door before anyone else had finished breakfast. His amber eyes remained fixed on the wilderness beyond the porch. Ethan zipped his winter jacket and folded Ryan's map into an inside pocket. Michael adjusted his gloves while Emily wrapped an extra scarf around Lily's neck. The young girl slipped the silver pendant beneath her coat and smiled when Ghost briefly nudged her hand. An hour later they stepped into the snow. The cold air bit at their cheeks, but the sky above had begun to clear. Sunlight reflected across the drifts like scattered diamonds. Ghost moved ahead of the group, following a route only he seemed to understand. He never hesitated. Never doubled back. The old shepherd traveled with the confidence of someone returning to a place he had once known well. Ethan followed closely behind. Every so often he checked Ryan's map. The direction matched perfectly. The trail climbed gradually through dense pines and across a frozen meadow nearly 300 yards wide. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Ravens circled high overhead. Somewhere in the distance a creek moved beneath a shell of ice. As the hours passed, Michael found himself thinking less about the storm and more about his brother. Ryan had been gone for years. Yet somehow his presence seemed stronger now than it had been in a very long time. It lived in the map. In the photograph. In the dog that still carried his memory. Shortly before noon, Ghost stopped at the edge of a rocky ridgeline. The shepherd stood perfectly still, ears lifted toward the horizon. Ethan climbed beside him and looked ahead. His breath caught. Perched atop a distant rise stood an old fire lookout tower. Weathered by time. Half hidden among snow-covered evergreens. The silent ridge. "That is it," Ethan said quietly. Nobody spoke for a moment. The structure looked forgotten by the world. Yet something about it felt important. Sacred, almost. Ghost immediately continued forward. The final climb proved steep. Wind swept across the exposed ridge, carrying fine crystals of snow through the sunlight. By the time they reached the tower, everyone was breathing hard. The wooden stairs groaned softly beneath the weight of ice. Ghost circled the base once. Then he stopped beside a large stone partially buried beneath the snow. He lowered his nose and began digging. Ethan knelt beside him. Together they cleared away several inches of packed snow. Beneath it rested a small metal marker secured to the rock. Time had tarnished the surface, but the engraving remained visible. Ryan Carter. Ethan stared at the name. Michael slowly removed his gloves. For several seconds nobody moved. The mountains stretched endlessly around them. Wind whispered through the pines below. Ghost sat beside the marker and gazed toward the horizon. Not searching anymore. Not waiting. Simply watching the sunlight spill across the snow as though he had finally arrived exactly where he was meant to be. For a long time, nobody spoke. The mountains seemed to absorb every thought and every memory, holding them gently beneath the vast winter sky. Michael stood before the metal marker, his eyes fixed on his brother's name. The wind moved softly across the ridge now, no longer carrying the fury of the storm but something quieter. Something peaceful. Ghost remained seated beside the stone, his posture calm and steady. Ethan knelt near the marker and brushed away the remaining snow. Beneath the engraved name, another inscription slowly emerged. The letters were faint but readable. Not lost. Just waiting to be found. Emily covered her mouth. Lily stared silently. Michael lowered his head. For years he had carried questions that never seemed to have answers. Now, standing on this forgotten ridge, he felt something unexpected. Not sadness. Not regret. Relief. The kind that comes when a door finally closes after remaining open for far too long. Ethan carefully inspected the base of the stone. Something caught his attention. Wedged between two rocks rested a small waterproof pouch protected from the weather. Time had faded its color, but it remained intact. Ghost immediately stood and walked closer. Ethan removed the pouch and opened it carefully. Inside rested several folded papers and a sealed envelope. The front contained only 3 words written in Ryan's familiar handwriting. For my family. Michael's hands trembled as Ethan passed him the envelope. The paper felt impossibly light. Yet somehow it carried the weight of years. He opened it slowly. The letter inside had been preserved remarkably well. The first line immediately brought tears to his eyes. If you are reading this, then Ghost finally did what I always believed he would do. Emily gently wrapped an arm around him as he continued reading. Ryan's words were simple. Honest. He spoke about family. About gratitude. About faith. He wrote that life rarely follows the path people expect, but love has a way of finding its destination anyway. He thanked Michael for being the brother who never stopped believing. He told Lily, though she had been only a dream at the time he wrote the letter, to grow up brave and kind. And at the very end, he wrote something that left everyone silent. Take care of Ghost. He was never just my partner. He was my reminder that loyalty is one of God's greatest gifts. Lily looked toward the old German shepherd. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Ghost simply sat beside the stone, watching the sunlight spread across the snowy valleys below. Ethan unfolded the remaining papers. Most contained personal notes and coordinates from old hiking routes Ryan loved exploring. Nothing mysterious. Nothing dramatic. Just pieces of a life carefully preserved. The discovery felt strangely beautiful. Not because it revealed a secret, but because it revealed a man. The afternoon sun drifted lower behind the distant peaks. Golden light painted the snow in shades of amber and silver. Michael folded the letter and slipped it carefully inside his jacket. For the first time in many years, he felt close to his brother again. Not through memories. Through understanding. Ghost slowly stood and walked to Lily's side. She wrapped her arms around his neck. The old shepherd leaned gently against her. Together they looked out across the endless mountains, while somewhere above them, an eagle circled silently beneath the bright winter sky. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. Snow still lingered in the shadows of the tallest pines, but the valleys below had begun to awaken. Streams flowed freely again. Wildflowers pushed through patches of thawing earth. The world that had once seemed frozen in silence now carried the gentle sounds of renewal. Nearly 4 months had passed since the day Ghost led the Carter family through the storm. Yet not a single member of the family had forgotten what happened on that mountain. On a bright April morning, a familiar truck climbed the winding road toward Ethan's cabin. Michael sat behind the wheel. Emily smiled beside him. Lily pressed her face against the window, searching eagerly through the trees. The moment the cabin appeared, so did Ghost. The old German shepherd stepped onto the porch and lifted his head. His muzzle had grown a little wider. His movement slightly slower. But his eyes remained the same. Calm. Wise. Steady. Lily was out of the truck before it fully stopped. Ghost met her halfway across the yard. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and the shepherd leaned gently into the embrace. Ethan watched from the porch with a quiet smile. Some bonds did not need many words. They simply continued. The day passed peacefully. They shared lunch beneath the pines. Michael showed Ethan a frame containing Ryan's letter, carefully preserved behind glass. Emily brought photographs from a recent family trip. Lily spent hours walking beside Ghost through the forest trails near the cabin. Everywhere she went, the old shepherd followed. Late that afternoon they returned to Silent Ridge one final time. The mountain looked different now. Green patches had begun replacing the endless white snow. Sunlight warmed the rocks. Birds moved through the branches overhead. Together they stood beside Ryan's marker. Michael placed fresh flowers at its base. No speeches were made. No grand promises spoken. The mountains had already heard everything that mattered. Ghost walked forward and lay beside the stone. The same place he had chosen months earlier. A gentle breeze moved through his fur. Lily sat beside him, resting one hand on his shoulder. Ethan looked toward the horizon where endless ridges faded into the distance. He thought about all the missions he had completed throughout his life. Some had names. Some had objectives. Some ended with medals. Yet none stayed with him the way this one did. Because this mission had never been about reaching a destination. It had been about bringing people home. As the sun began to set, golden light spilled across the ridge. The world seemed painted in amber and silver. Ghost lifted his head and gazed toward the horizon. Peace rested in his eyes. The waiting was over. The searching was over. Somewhere beyond memory and distance, a promise had finally been kept. Michael folded an arm around Emily. Lily stayed beside Ghost. Ethan stood quietly behind them all. And in that final light, surrounded by mountains, family, and the enduring loyalty of one remarkable dog, everyone understood the same simple truth. Sometimes the smallest guide arrives on 4 paws. Sometimes the path through the storm begins with trust. And sometimes what saves a life is not strength, luck, or circumstance, but a faithful heart that never stops leading the way home.